By the winter of 1941, the chill of the Eastern European plains was more than a cold, it was an omen. The Soviet Union, vast and sprawling, faced the concentrated might of Hitler's Wehrmacht, an army honed by years of conquest and brutal discipline. Deep in the east, divisions gathered at the borders, their engines idling, their troops tense, every battalion poised to strike at the heart of the Soviet state. Reconnaissance planes traced the frozen rivers, while generals in ornate, leather-lined offices pored over maps, tracing the pathways of an assault designed to cripple a nation before it could fully awaken. As the first gliders lifted off from hidden airfields in East Prussia, carrying elite paratroopers and specialized assault units, the Germans believed the outcome was inevitable. Their objective was audacious: seize critical airfields, capture supply routes, and paralyze the Soviet command structure before reinforcements could even form. Yet somewhere deep in the snowbound forests and bitterly cold rivers, eyes watched the skies, alert to the first signs of the approaching storm. And in those eyes lay a question: could the Red Army rise fast enough to meet a force that had already tasted victory across Europe? From the Soviet side, preparations were unfolding in quiet urgency. Soldiers, many still teenagers or barely trained officers, checked rifles, loaded ammunition, and reinforced defensive positions. Anti-aircraft batteries hummed to life, their crews scanning the gray, heavy skies, expecting the first shadow of enemy aircraft at any moment. Villagers in nearby towns watched with nervous eyes as trucks and horse-drawn sleds delivered supplies to fortified positions, unaware that their lives were about to become part of a global struggle. The first chilling sign came just before dawn, a distant roar of engines, too organized to be mere winter whines, too precise to be random. The German airborne units were approaching, and yet the Soviets did not panic. Instead, they moved with the careful efficiency born of knowing that survival depended not on fear, but on strategy and courage. But even with preparation, the question lingered: would they be enough to repel the coming deluge of steel and fire? High above, the paratroopers began their descent, silhouetted against the waning night sky. Their mission was to strike swiftly, to seize key runways, and hold them until the main force poured in. But winter winds tore at parachutes, and flares lit the horizon, revealing positions of defenders who were ready, despite the purges that had hollowed the officer corps years earlier. Each landing was a gamble, each shadowed approach a risk of death or capture. And somewhere in that chaos, a critical mistake could change the fate of an entire campaign. Meanwhile, Soviet commanders, often young and inexperienced, coordinated defensive lines across frozen terrain. Radio operators relayed orders frantically, artillery crews adjusted their guns, and infantry squads moved into prepared positions. They had no certainty of victory, only the hope that courage, improvisation, and the bitter winter itself might slow the unstoppable tide. Behind every snowdrift and every shattered fence, the tension mounted. And as the first distant explosions echoed across the ice and snow, one question burned through the ranks: who would strike first, and who would survive the initial clash? The stage was set. The world held its breath as to forces, one seasoned, one battered, but determined, prepared to collide with consequences that would ripple far beyond the frozen rivers of the East. And as the sun rose on the horizon, casting pale light across the snow, a silent reckoning awaited both attacker and defender. Before we move on to the next segment, don't forget to like and subscribe. Every click helps more people discover these stories of courage, strategy, and history that changed the world. At dawn, a ghostly quiet settled over the frozen fields, broken only by the distant hum of engines. Hundreds of German troops, crammed into gliders and transport aircraft, advanced toward the critical Soviet airfields. The assault had been rehearsed for months. Every movement, every landing, every obstacle had been meticulously calculated. Yet as the first wave approached, the icy wind and drifting snow conspired to turn precision into chaos. Suddenly, a bright flash lit the horizon. Anti-aircraft fire had opened up far sooner than the attackers expected. Planes shuddered under the hail of bullets, some spiraling into frozen rivers below. Explosions tore through hangars and fuel depots, sending black smoke spiraling into the gray morning sky. Soldiers aboard the gliders gripped their seats, bracing for impact. Well below, the first Soviet defenders scrambled into action. Barricades were raised, vehicles moved to block runways, and machine guns ripped through the chilling air. The German assault, though expertly planned, was already meeting a resistance it had not anticipated. And somewhere within this storm of fire and steel, a single misstep threatened to unravel the entire invasion. As the initial landings occurred, the Red Army's young conscripts faced the unimaginable. They were outnumbered, many without combat experience, and yet their determination burned hotter than the fires around them. Improvised tactics became crucial. Artillery pieces were repositioned on the fly, trucks were abandoned as makeshift barricades, and every available weapon was brought to bear. From the air, the Germans saw their meticulously organized plan beginning to falter, and a tense question lingered. Could these inexperienced defenders hold long enough for reinforcements to arrive, or was this the beginning of a catastrophic collapse? By mid-morning, chaos dominated both sides. Soviet radar units tracked every approach, sending warnings to artillery crews who had seconds to adjust their aim before German troops hit the ground. Yet even as the defenders managed to slow the enemy, the sky above became a battlefield itself. Smoke from burning aircraft obscured vision, while sporadic strafing runs by German pilots attempted to disrupt the fragile Soviet lines. And in one particularly daring maneuver, a squad of paratroopers attempted to cut off the Soviet reinforcements by seizing a critical bridge nearby, but what awaited them there would change the momentum of the battle. On the ground, the clash was brutal and immediate. Explosions shook frozen earth, rifles cracked against the whine of artillery, and soldiers fought not just for territory, but for survival. Every building became a fortress, every snowdrift a shield. Soviet officers barked orders through frozen winds, improvising as the situation evolved by the second. The German troops, expecting minimal resistance, now found themselves in pockets of deadly fire, trapped by the very defenses they had underestimated. And as the day wore on, the looming question became ever more urgent. Could the paratroopers hold their ground long enough for reinforcements to arrive, or would the airfield slip forever into Soviet hands? By late morning, the Soviet defenders had performed feats of improvisation that even seasoned commanders might have doubted possible. Damaged aircraft were used as cover, frozen rivers became defensive moats, and civilians assisted in moving supplies to the front lines. Despite their numerical advantage, the Germans now faced an enemy that was unpredictable, determined, and remarkably resilient. And in the midst of this chaos, a single radio transmission signaled that a decisive counterattack might already be forming, a move that could shift the balance of the battle in ways neither side fully understood. As the first strike ground to its tense pause, the outcome remained uncertain. The airfields were partially under enemy control, but the Red Army's ingenuity had prevented total collapse. Smoke, fire, and gunfire had transformed the serene winter landscape into a scene of unrelenting combat. Somewhere beyond the horizon, reinforcements were beginning their desperate march, but whether they would arrive in time or at all hung in a delicate balance. The fate of the airfields, and perhaps the early course of the entire campaign, now rested on the next crucial hours. Would the Soviet forces repel the invaders, or would the Germans establish a foothold that might tilt the war decisively in their favor? The answer was yet to come. The winter landscape, once quiet and still, now echoed with the roar of engines, the clatter of boots on frozen roads, and the distant rumble of artillery. The Soviet defenders, battered but unbroken, had bought precious hours that might determine the fate of not only the airfield, but the defense of the entire region. From nearby garrisons, mechanized units mobilized, their tanks and artillery crawling over snow-packed roads, engines churning through ice and mud. Civilians, armed not with rifles, but with determination, lent trucks, sleds, and manpower, ensuring that these vital reinforcements would reach the front line in time. By mid-afternoon, the first waves of fresh troops appeared on the horizon, their banners and insignia barely visible through the swirling snow and smoke. Artillery crews immediately targeted the runways, shelling open stretches to prevent further German landings. The isolated paratroopers, once confident, found themselves increasingly surrounded, their supply lines cut and reinforcements nowhere in sight. And as the first shells landed near their positions, a chilling realization spread among them. They were trapped, their mission teetering on the edge of disaster. Soviet infantry advanced methodically, clearing hangars, barracks, and fortified positions with the precision of soldiers who had grown up learning to endure hardship. Tanks rumbled behind them, providing cover and drawing enemy fire. Helicopters appeared in the sky, the shrill hum of their rotors cutting through the smoke, dropping troops where they were most needed and suppressing German positions. Each coordinated push tightened the encirclement, and for the German paratroopers, the airfield transformed from a potential stronghold into a death trap. But one critical question lingered. Could the Soviets close the noose before the Germans regrouped and attempted a desperate breakout? In the midst of the chaos, heroism emerged in every corner. A lone Soviet officer commandeered a stalled artillery truck, using it to push a damaged anti-tank gun into position just as German troops attempted to flank from the east. Civilians guided the armored units across hidden paths, their knowledge of the terrain proving invaluable. Even under relentless enemy fire, every reinforcement brought a renewed sense of hope to the defenders, yet the outcome remained uncertain. The Germans, though surrounded, were seasoned combatants capable of improvising, and their next move could ignite a deadly counterassault. By late afternoon, the battlefield had shifted dramatically. The Germans, once on the offensive, now struggled to maintain positions in isolated pockets, cut off from supplies and support. Soviet troops, reinforced and emboldened, advanced from multiple directions, systematically reclaiming territory. Helicopters provided covering fire, artillery barraged defensive positions, and infantry squads moved with relentless coordination. Every inch of progress was hard-fought, and every captured position brought both relief and renewed peril. And as the Soviets prepared to fully encircle the enemy, a tense, unspoken question gripped every soldier. Could they end the battle before nightfall, or would darkness give the Germans a chance to regroup? The turning tide was now unmistakable. German paratroopers, exhausted and disoriented, attempted desperate maneuvers to escape, only to find their paths blocked by Soviet tanks and barricades. Fires from downed aircraft lit the snowy fields, casting grotesque shadows over advancing troops. The courage of the initial defenders, combined with timely reinforcements, had transformed a precarious defense into a relentless counterattack. And yet, as night approached, one final, critical moment would determine whether victory was complete or merely the prelude to another brutal struggle. Amid the smoke and chaos, a voice crackled over a Soviet radio. Fresh armored units were en route, cutting off the remaining escape routes and sealing the encirclement. The paratroopers were cornered, their mission failing at every turn. The once feared invaders were now vulnerable, isolated, and on the brink of surrender. But the battlefield remained unforgiving, and even the most decisive movements carried enormous risk. The next hours would test courage, resilience, and the unforgiving hand of winter itself. Before we move on to the final segment, don't forget to like and subscribe. Every subscription helps share these intense, real-life stories of courage and strategy with the world, ensuring more people can experience history as it happened. Nightfall draped the battlefield in a heavy, almost suffocating darkness. The frozen fields were littered with wreckage, shattered gliders, burning vehicles, and the remnants of a desperate German assault. The Soviet forces, bolstered by reinforcements, had closed the encirclement, leaving the paratroopers with nowhere to retreat. The air was thick with smoke, the acrid scent of gunpowder and burning fuel mingling with the cold wind that cut through every layer of clothing. And in that darkness, a final, tense question lingered over both sides. Would the Germans fight to the last man, or would surrender become the only option? The isolated German units, once confident and meticulously trained, scrambled to establish defensive positions. Every building, every hangar, every small rise in the frozen terrain became a barricade, a last line of resistance, but the Soviets pressed in relentlessly. Infantry advanced in coordinated waves, tanks maneuvered to cut off escape routes, and artillery pounded enemy positions with unrelenting precision. The paratroopers, surrounded and outgunned, faced a stark reality. Survival depended not on boldness, but on endurance, and even that seemed in doubt. Amid the chaos, small pockets of German soldiers attempted desperate breakout maneuvers. They dashed across snow-covered fields, trying to reach any path that might lead them away from encirclement. But Soviet gunners anticipated their every move, shells striking the frozen ground mere meters ahead, forcing retreat after retreat. The once feared invaders were now prey, and the tide of the battle had shifted irrevocably. And as the night deepened, a single, critical question remained: would any of these soldiers survive to tell the tale? By evening, the airfield was entirely under Soviet control. Fires still burned, but the organized defense and counterattack had transformed chaos into order. Survivors of the German assault were driven into nearby fields, disarmed and trapped, unable to mount any meaningful counterattack. The heroic stand of the initial defenders, coupled with the timely arrival of reinforcements, had turned an almost certain defeat into a decisive victory. But while victory was achieved, the cost was staggering, and the shadow of war still stretched over every frozen mile of territory. The aftermath of the battle revealed the true scale of the struggle. The airfield, once a strategic prize for the German advance, now stood as a testament to resilience and coordination. Soviet engineers immediately began repairing and fortifying positions, ensuring that no future assault could take the same route without facing formidable resistance. Commanders assessed losses, replenished ammunition, and tended to the wounded, understanding that this victory, while significant, was but one step in a much larger and bloodier campaign. Yet, even in this moment of triumph, uncertainty lingered. How long could the Soviet forces hold the initiative, and would the Germans strike again with even greater force? Strategically, the consequences of the battle were profound. By holding the airfield and delaying the enemy advance, the Soviet command bought invaluable time to organize defenses further west, protecting the capital and preventing a potentially catastrophic breakthrough. Intelligence officers noted that German morale had been shaken, their meticulously rehearsed plan thrown into disarray by unexpected resistance and quick-thinking improvisation. Across the Eastern Front, news of the battle spread quietly, sending a message to the invaders: the Soviet Union would not yield easily, and every inch of land would be contested fiercely. As the first pale light of dawn broke over the battlefield, the snow reflected the scars of combat. Silence, save for the occasional crackle of artillery or the groan of damaged vehicles, replaced the roar of battle. The defenders, exhausted and frozen, knew that while one fight was won, the war was far from over. They had proven that courage, preparation, and the determination to defend one's homeland could overcome even the most formidable adversary. And as the sun rose, the promise of a long, grueling campaign loomed, leaving both sides to ponder the next chapter in a conflict that would shape the world. The story of this battle would live on not just in military records, but in the hearts of those who fought, endured, and triumphed against overwhelming odds. Every act of bravery, every improvisation under fire, had contributed to a turning point, proving that in the crucible of war, even the most unlikely defenders could alter the course of history.